The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the tin roof of Clara's modest bungalow on the edge of town. It was the kind of storm that made the world feel smaller, shrinking it to the size of a single street where the streetlights flickered and the gutters overflowed. Clara stood at her kitchen window, a mug of chamomile tea cooling in her hands, watching the water carve rivers along the cracked pavement. She'd always liked storms if there was something honest about their chaos, but tonight, her mind was elsewhere. The news had been grim all week: layoffs at the factory where she'd worked for 15 years, whispers of budget cuts at the community center where she volunteered, and her car, a stubborn old hatchback, had finally given up on the way home from the grocery store. She was stranded, financially and otherwise, and the weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone. She was about to turn away from the window when she saw a figure hunched under the dim glow of a street lamp, his silhouette blurred by the rain. He was tall, lanky, with a hood pulled tight over his head, but even from a distance, Clara could see the way his shoulders slumped, the way he clutched a tattered backpack like it was all he had. She'd seen plenty of folks like him in town lately. The economy was bleeding people dry, and the homeless encampment by the river had grown too big for the city council to ignore. Clara's heart gave a familiar tug, part pity, part guilt, part something she couldn't name. She told herself to keep her distance. She wasn't rich, wasn't young, wasn't naive. At 42, she knew better than to open her door to strangers. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, letting the rain soak him through, as if he had nowhere else to go. Clara sighed, set her mug on the counter, and grabbed her raincoat. "You're being stupid," she muttered to herself, but her feet were already moving toward the door. She stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting at her cheeks, and called out, "Hey, you okay out there?" The man's head snapped up, startled. He took a step back, his boots splashing in a puddle. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd thought, maybe in his 50s, with a scruffy beard peppered with grand eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. His clothes were mismatched, a threadbare jacket over a flannel shirt, jeans that were more holes than fabric. But there was something in his posture, a quiet dignity, that made Clara pause. "I'm fine," he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the rain. "Just a broken bar passing through." "You're getting drowned out there," Clara said, pulling her coat tighter. "You got a place to stay?" He hesitated, glancing down the street as if expecting an answer to appear. "I'll manage." Clara bit her lip. She knew that Tonya pride masking desperation. She'd heard it in her own voice when she'd called the bank last month, begging for an extension on her mortgage. She looked at her garage, a cramped space filled with boxes of junk she'd been meaning to sort through for years. It wasn't much, but it was dry. She pointed to it. "I've got a garage. It's not a hotel, but it'll keep you out of this mess for the night." "One night, that's it." The man blinked, like he wasn't sure he'd heard her right. "Why would you do that?" Clara shrugged, trying to play it off. "Because I'd want someone to do it for me." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for something in ulterior motives, maybe, or pity he didn't want. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "One night," he said. "I won't be trouble." She led him to the garage, unlocking the side door with a key that stuck in the damp. Inside, it smelled of motor oil and mildew, but it was dry, and there was a corner clear of boxes where he could sit. She grabbed an old sleeping bag from a shelf, one she'd used for camping back when she could afford vacations, and tossed it to him. "It's not much, but it's better than the street." He caught the sleeping bag and nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Thank you." "A broken bar?" "Clara," she said. "Just Clara." "Elliot," he replied, and for the first time, she saw the faintest hint of a smile, like a crack in a wall. She left him there, locking the garage door behind her, and went back to her kitchen. The tea was cold now, but she drank it anyway, trying to shake the feeling that she'd just done something reckless. She didn't know this man. He could be any dangerous, unstable, but something about his eyes, the way they'd held hers without flinching, made her think he wasn't. Or maybe she just wanted to believe it. Either way, it was one night. Tomorrow, he'd be gone, and she'd be back to her problems. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and gleaming under a weak sun. Clara woke early, her back stiff from a night of restless sleep. She pulled on a sweater and headed to the garage, half expecting to find it empty. But Elliot was there, sitting cross-legged on the sleeping bag, his backpack neatly packed beside him. He was holding a small, battered notebook, scribbling something with the stub of a pencil. When he saw her, he closed it quickly, tucking it into his jacket. "Morning," Clara said, leaning against the door frame. "You sleep okay?" "Better than I have in a while," he said, standing. He folded the sleeping bag with care, like it was something precious, and handed it back to her. "I'll be out of your hair now." She nodded, but something made her pause. Maybe it was the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried, or the way he didn't seem eager to leave despite his words. "You hungry?" she asked before she could stop herself. "I've got eggs, nothing fancy, but it's food." Elliot's eyes flickered with surprise, then gratitude. "I don't want to impose." "You're not," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure why she was pushing this. "Come on." In the kitchen, she scrambled eggs while he sat at the small table, his hands folded in his lap like he was trying not to take up space. The silence was awkward at first, but Clara filled it with small talk about the weather, the town, the diner on Main Street that still served decent coffee. Elliot listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words were measured, thoughtful. He didn't talk like someone who'd been on the streets for long. There was an education behind his voice, a life that hadn't always been this. "You from around here?" she asked, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. He shook his head, taking a small bite. "Used to be from a lot of places." "Nowhere now." Clara didn't press. She'd learned long ago that people carried their stories like baggage, some unpacked willingly, others kept it locked tight. Instead, she asked, "Where you headed next?" He shrugged, his eyes drifting to the window. "Wherever the road takes me." It wasn't much of an answer, but Clara let it go. They ate in silence after that, the clink of forks against plates the only sound. When he was done, he thanked her again, his voice softer this time, and stood to leave. She walked him to the door, watching as he slung his backpack over his shoulder and stepped into the damp morning air. "Take care, Elliot," she said, leaning against the door frame. He turned, his eyes meeting hers again. "You too, Clara." "And a broken bar, thank you." "Really?" She watched him walk down the street until he disappeared around the corner, his lanky figure blending into the gray of the town. She told herself that was the end of it, a small act of kindness, nothing more. But as she cleaned the dishes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd missed something, some detail about him that lingered just out of reach. The rest of the day passed in a blur of Britannia calling the mechanic about her car, sorting through bills she couldn't pay, checking her email for job leads that never came. By evening, she was exhausted, her mind heavy with the weight of her own life. She didn't think about Elliot again until she went to the garage to grab a toolbox for a loose cabinet door. That's when she saw it, a small envelope tucked into the corner where he'd slept, half hidden under a box. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the rough paper. It was sealed, her name written on the front in neat, deliberate handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, and a key, a heavy, old-fashioned one, like something from a different era. The note was brief, written in the same precise script. "Clara, you gave me something I haven't had in a long time, trust. This key opens a storage unit at the old warehouse on Route 17, Unit 204. What's inside is yours, if you want it. No strings, just a thank you. A. Elliot." Clara read it twice, her heart thudding. She turned the key over in her hand, its weight solid and real. Route 17 was on the outskirts of town, a stretch of industrial lots and abandoned warehouses. She'd driven past the storage place 100 times, never giving it a second thought. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as some kind of joke, or worse, a scam. But those eyes, that quiet dignity, came back to her. She grabbed her coat. The warehouse was a hulking relic, its paint peeling under the sodium glow of security lights. The night guard barely glanced at her ID before waving her through. Unit 204 was at the end of a long row, its metal door rusted but sturdy. Clara's hand shook as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy click. Inside, the unit was small, barely bigger than her garage, but it was packed. Stacks of wooden crates lined the walls, each labeled with faded ink. Books, records, art. In the center was a table, and on it, a single leather-bound ledger. Clara opened it, her breath catching as she scanned the pages. It wasn't a ledger, it was a catalog, detailing the contents of the crates, first editions of rare books, vinyl records from artists she'd only read about, paintings with signatures that made her head spin. And at the back, a single page with a notarized document, a deed of transfer, signing the contents of the unit to her name, dated that morning. Clara's knees buckled. She sat on the cold concrete, the ledger in her lap, trying to make sense of it. Who was Elliot? Why her? The question spun, but no answers came. She locked the unit and drove home, the key heavy in her pocket. The next morning, she called the storage company, half expecting them to say it was a mistake, but the deed was real, the unit hers. She spent the day researching, making cautious calls to appraisers. By evening, she had a number. The contents were worth millions, not thousands of millions, enough to pay off her house, her debts, and more, enough to change her life. She sat at her kitchen table, the note in front of her, rereading Elliot's words. Trust, that's what he'd said she'd given him, and now, he'd given her something impossible in return. Clara didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about Elliot's eyes, the way they'd held hers, like he'd seen something in her she didn't see in herself. She wanted to find him, to ask why, to understand, but deep down, she knew he was gone, a ghost who'd slipped back into the world he'd come from. She sold the first painting a month later, a small one, enough to cover her mortgage and fix her car. The rest she kept, not for the money, but for the mystery of it. She started volunteering more at the community center, using the funds to help other people like Elliot, or who she thought he might have been. Every night, she looked out her window, half hoping to see him under the street lamp again, but he never came. Years later, she found a story online, buried in an obscure forum. A man named Elliot Grayson, a tech mogul who'd vanished a decade ago after giving away his fortune. No photo, no proof, just a name and a whisper of a man who'd walked away from everything. Clara read it and smiled, her fingers brushing the key she now wore around her neck. She didn't know if it was him, but she liked to think it was. And in her heart, she thanked him not for the money, but for reminding her that trust, even in a storm, could change everything. Clara never saw Elliot again, but her shadow lingered. The storage unit's contents transformed her life, not just with wealth but with purpose. She turned her bungalow into a halfway house, offering shelter to those the world had cast aside. Each guest reminded her of Elliot, his quiet dignity, his guarded story. She never told them about the millionaire who'd slept in her garage, but she carried his note in her pocket, a talisman against cynicism. The town noticed the change. The community center thrived, the homeless encampment shrank. Clara became a quiet legend, though she'd wave off the praise with a laugh. One winter, a young woman arrived, soaked and shivering, clutching a sketchbook. Clara gave her a bed, a meal, and a chance. Months later, the woman's art hung in a gallery, fetching thousands. When she tried to repay Clara, Clara just smiled and said, "Pass it on." It was what Elliot would have done, she thought. And as the years passed, Clara kept the storage unit locked, not for greed, but as a reminder. Kindness could be a key, unlocking lives in ways no one could predict. The rain was relentless, a cold, gray curtain that swallowed the small town of Millionaire. Clara stood at her kitchen window, nursing a mug of chamomile tea, watching the street turn into a river of mud and leaves. At 42, she'd seen her share of storms, but this one felt personal, like the sky was mirroring the chaos of her life. The factory where she'd worked for 15 years had shut down, her savings were dwindling, and her car had sputtered to a stop that morning, leaving her stranded with a trunk full of groceries she could barely afford. She sighed, the steam from her tea fogging the glass, and tried to push away the weight of it all. Then she saw him, a lone figure under the flickering street lamp, hunched against the rain. He was tall, his frame swallowed by a tattered jacket, a hood obscuring his face. A backpack hung from one shoulder, sagging like it carried the weight of his world. Clara knew the look, another soul chewed up by the economy, left to drift. The homeless encampment by the river had grown lately, spilling over with people who'd lost jobs, homes, hope. She told herself to look away. She wasn't a charity, and strangers could be trouble. But he didn't move, just stood there, letting the rain soak him through. and something in Clara stirred empathy, or maybe just defiance against her own bad luck. She grabbed her raincoat and stepped onto the porch, the wind slapping her face. "Hey!" she called. "You okay out there?" The man startled, his head snapping up. He took a step back, boots splashing in a puddle. Up close, she saw he was older, 50s, maybe with a scruffy beard and eyes that held a quiet intensity, like they'd seen too much but hadn't given up. His clothes were a patchwork of thrift store finds, but there was a steadiness in how he stood, a pride that didn't match his circumstances. "I'm fine," he said, his voice low, cutting through the storm. "Just passing through." "You're gonna drown," Clara said, pulling her coat tighter. "I've got a garage. It's not much, but it's dry." "One night, no strings." He blinked, like her words didn't compute. "Why would you do that?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Because I'd hope someone would do it for me." He studied her, his eyes searching for something, a pity, maybe, or a catch. Finding neither, he nodded. "One night." "I won't be any trouble." Clara led him to the garage, a cramped space stuffed with boxes of forgotten junk. The air smelled of damp wood and motor oil, but it was shelter. She dug out an old sleeping bag from a shelf, one she hadn't used since her camping days, and tossed it to him. "It's not the Ritz, but it'll do." He caught it, his fingers brushing the fabric like it was something rare. "Thank you." "A broken bar?" "Clara," she said. "Just Clara." "Elliot," he replied, and for a moment, his lips twitched into something like a smile. She locked the garage behind her and returned to her kitchen, the tea now cold. Doubt crept in as she sipped it. What was she thinking? Letting a stranger in? He could be dangerous, a thief, worse. But those eyes they'd held hers without flinching, steady and unguarded. She shook her head, telling herself it was one night. Tomorrow, he'd be gone. Morning came, the rain replaced by a pale sun. Clara woke early, her back stiff from a restless night. She pulled on a sweater and headed to the garage, half expecting it to be empty. But Elliot was there, sitting on the sleeping bag, scribbling in a small, worn notebook. He closed it quickly when he saw her, tucking it into his jacket. "Morning," she said, leaning against the door frame. "Sleep okay?" "Better than most nights," he said, standing. He folded the sleeping bag with care and handed it back. "I'll be going now." Something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried, or the faint gratitude in his voice. "You hungry?" she asked. "I've got eggs." "Nothing special, but it's food." His eyes flickered with surprise. "I don't want to impose." "You're not," she said, already turning toward the house. "Come on." In the kitchen, she scrambled eggs while he sat at her small table, hands folded like he was trying not to take up space. The silence was heavy at first, but Clara filled it with chatter about the town, the diner's bad coffee, the weather. Elliot listened, his responses short but thoughtful, his voice carrying a hint of something refined, like he'd known a different life. "You from around here?" she asked, sliding a plate of eggs and toast across the table. He shook his head, taking a small bite. "Used to be from a lot of places." "Nowhere now." Clara nodded, recognizing the weight behind his words. She didn't push. They ate quietly after that, the clink of forks the only sound. When he finished, he thanked her, his voice softer now, and stood to leave. She walked him to the door, watching as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. "Take care, Elliot," she said, leaning against the door frame. He turned, his eyes meeting hers again. "You too, Clara." "And a broken bar, thank you." "Really?" She watched him disappear down the street, his lanky figure blending into the gray morning. She told herself that was a small kindness, nothing more. But as she washed the dishes, a nagging feeling lingered, like she'd missed something about him. That evening, in the garage for a toolbox, she found it, an envelope tucked where he'd slept, her name scrawled on it in neat handwriting. Inside was a note and a heavy, old-fashioned key. "Clara, you gave me trust when I had none. This key opens Unit 204 at the warehouse on Route 17. What's inside is yours. No strings, just gratitude." A. Elliot, her heart raced. Route 17 was a rundown stretch of warehouses, a place she'd never had reason to visit. She grabbed her coat, the key cold in her hand. The warehouse was a maze of rusted doors under harsh lights. The guard barely glanced at her before waving her through. Unit 204's lock clicked open, revealing a small space packed with crates labeled books, art, records. A table held a leather-bound ledger. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. It catalogued the crate's contents: rare first editions, signed paintings, vintage vinyl. At the back, a notarized deed transferred it all to her, dated that morning. Clara sank to the floor, the ledger in her lap. Who was Elliot? Why her? The questions spun, but no answers came. She locked the unit and drove home, the key a heavy weight in her pocket. The next day, she confirmed the deed was real. Appraisers valued the contents at millions. Millions, enough to erase her debts, fix her car, change her life. But as she sat at her kitchen table, rereading Elliot's note, she felt something deeper than relief, a spark of purpose, ignited by a stranger's trust. She never saw Elliot again, but his gift reshaped her world. The storage unit's wealth wasn't just money, it was a chance to rebuild, not just for herself but for others. Clara sold a single painting, a modest one, fetching enough to pay off her mortgage and repair her car. The rest she kept, not for greed, but as a reminder of the night she'd chosen kindness over fear. She turned her bungalow into a halfway house, offering beds to those society had discarded, the men and women with tattered bags and guarded eyes, each one a faint echo of Elliot. She didn't tell them about the millionaire who'd slept in her garage, but she carried his note in her pocket, its words a quiet mantra: trust could change everything. The town noticed. Millionaire, once a place where hope flickered like a dying bulb, began to shift. Clara poured the money into the community center, funding job training, meals, and a small art program for kids. The homeless encampment by the river shrank as people found footing, some through her home, others through the ripple of her work. Locals started calling her Saint Clara, a title she laughed off with a wave. Just doing what's right, she'd say, but her eyes would drift to the window, searching the street for a familiar silhouette. One winter, a young woman showed up at Clara's door, drenched and shivering, clutching a sketchbook like it was her lifeline. Her name was Leila, barely 20, with a story Clara knew too well: a lost job, no family, nowhere to go. Clara gave her a bed, a hot meal, and a quiet space to draw. Leila's sketches were raw, vivid, full of pain and beauty. Clara saw something in them, a spark she hadn't seen since Elliot's eyes met hers. She connected Leila with a gallery owner who owed her a favor. Months later, Leila's work hung in a city gallery, selling for thousands. When Leila tried to repay her, tears in her eyes, Clara shook her head. "Pass it on," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was what Elliot would have wanted. Clara kept the storage unit locked, visiting it only when doubt crept in. The crates stood like sentinels, their contents a testament to a man she'd never truly know. She researched him once, late at night, her laptop casting a glow over her kitchen. A forum mentioned an Elliot Grayson, a tech mogul who'd vanished years ago after giving away his fortune. No photo, no proof, just a name and a story that felt too close to hers. She closed the laptop, her fingers brushing the key she now wore on a chain around her neck. Whether he was Grayson or just a man with a past, it didn't matter. He'd seen something in her, a kindness worth rewarding, and that was enough. Years passed, and Clara's halfway house grew. She hired staff, expanded the garage into a proper dorm, and funded scholarships for kids like Leila. The town thrived, its streets cleaner, its people warmer. Clara never took credit, but everyone knew. At night, she'd sit by her window, watching the street lamp where Elliot had stood. She'd wonder where he was, if he knew what he'd started. Sometimes, she'd swear she saw a shadow move in the dark, tall and lanky, but it was always just the wind. The key stayed with her, a weight and a comfort. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about trust, hers in him, his in her, and hers in the world. She'd given a stranger one night, and he'd given her a legacy. And in every person she helped, every life she touched, Clara passed on the gift, hoping somewhere, Elliot was doing the same.